Thanks for watching Endgame Economics. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. It's completely free for you, and it helps us continue making more videos like this.
Picture this. It's 8 in the morning on a random Tuesday, and you're standing outside your local bank. But you aren't there to make a deposit. The line wraps around the block literally 3 times because you and everyone else are desperately trying to withdraw your life savings. Why? Well, because that carton of milk you bought just yesterday for 50 units of currency, it now costs 150. Your government has just defaulted on its sovereign debt. The currency is in absolute freefall. The prime minister has resigned, and panic isn't just setting in, it is fully here. But then, a fleet of black sedans pulls up to the Ministry of Finance. Out steps a group of people in perfectly tailored suits carrying leather briefcases. Now, they aren't an invading army, but to your government, they honestly might as well be. They are the International Monetary Fund. And depending on exactly who you ask, they are either the economic paramedics arriving at the scene of a massive financial heart attack, or they're the Grim Reapers coming to collect the soul of your nation's economy. Welcome to this explainer.
Okay, let's dive into this. The IMF isn't just your standard commercial bank down the street. It is the absolute lender of last resort for the entire globe. When a central bank totally runs out of money and a country literally cannot pay its bills, this is who they call. As of late 2024, the IMF operates with a staggering lending capacity of right around $1 trillion. That is 1,000 billions, guys. We're talking about an incomprehensible amount of financial firepower that is capable of instantly stabilizing a global crisis or fundamentally altering the laws of sovereign nations in the blink of an eye.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll meet the global lender, then take a look inside the IMF vault and examine the bitter medicine of its lending rules. After that, we'll trace decades of debt crises, introduce the new global challengers, and finally ask the big question: is the IMF fundamentally a firefighter or an arsonist? Let's get into it.
To really grasp how this all works, we have to step back to the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. This is where the entire global economic order was completely rewritten. The US dollar became the king of the world, pegged strictly to gold. But to keep countries from secretly devaluing their currencies and cheating this brand new system, they needed referees. So 2 institutions were born, and it's absolutely vital to know the difference between them. The IMF was created strictly for short-term stability. Basically, they are the emergency room you call to manage a crisis and stop the financial bleeding. The World Bank, on the other hand, is for long-term development. Think of them as the gym you join for a 10-year fitness plan to build schools, dams, and infrastructure.
So, you might be wondering, where exactly does the IMF get its $1 trillion? I mean, it doesn't print it directly, and it doesn't collect taxes from citizens. Actually, it operates very much like an incredibly exclusive, high-stakes country club. Every single one of its 190 member nations pays a subscription fee known as a quota. The size of your quota is determined by the size of your economy. So, the United States chips in roughly $113 billion, while a tiny island nation like Tuvalu puts in what amounts to pocket lint at this scale, about $3.5 million. This quota serves as the bankroll, determines a country's credit limit, and most crucially, dictates their voting power.
Now here's where the math of that voting power gets completely fascinating. Unlike the United Nations, where every country effectively gets one equal vote, the IMF runs strictly on the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. Any major structural decision at the IMF requires an 85% supermajority to pass. Well, the United States currently holds approximately 16.5% of the vote. Do that mental math, and the maximum possible vote without the United States is exactly 83.5%. This effectively gives the US a permanent mathematical veto. So the institution basically operates as a bank controlled by the richest nations for the developing ones.
But wait, the vault isn't just filled with regular cash. Back in 1969, the IMF acted like financial alchemists and invented a sort of paper gold called special drawing rights, or SDRs. Now, you can't go buy groceries with these. They are essentially an imaginary reserve asset. Think of it like a casino chip that countries can exchange for hard currency to inject life-saving liquidity into a seized-up global system. To put that into perspective, during the 2021 pandemic recovery, the IMF printed an astounding $650 billion worth of these SDRs right out of thin air. But because they distribute them based on those quotas we just discussed, the US received over $100 billion, while the poorest nations in desperate need got absolute crumbs.
And this brilliantly illustrates what exactly backs the value of those imaginary coins. An SDR is fundamentally tied to a basket of 5 major global currencies. The US dollar carries the most weight at 43%, followed by the euro at 29%, with the Chinese renminbi, Japanese yen, and British pound rounding out the rest. When a nation is completely out of options, they can take their allocated SDRs and swap them with another member country for these exact hard currencies, finally getting the real dollars or euros they desperately need to buy essential medicine or service their looming debts.
All of this funding builds into the absolute most controversial part of the IMF playbook, the bitter medicine. You see, when a bankrupt sovereign government flies to Washington to ask for a multi-billion-dollar bailout, the IMF doesn't just happily hand over a wire transfer. No way. The borrowing government is forced to sign a letter of intent, agreeing to what's called conditionality. In exchange for the cash, they must enact specific, often extremely severe policy changes, literally rewriting their own national laws. It creates a massive, direct collision between a nation's sovereignty, its inherent right to rule itself, and its solvency.
For decades, this conditionality was dictated by a rigid, one-size-fits-all set of rules known as the Washington Consensus. It primarily demands three things. First, strict austerity, so slashing government salaries, pensions, and food or fuel subsidies. Second, privatization, forcing the sale of state-owned water companies or airlines to raise quick cash. And third, liberalization, removing trade tariffs and letting the currency float. It's kind of the economic equivalent of throwing a drowning man a life preserver, but demanding he sell his kidneys to you before he's allowed to grab it. Yes, it raises capital and cuts costs, but crawling onto the shore missing vital organs tends to spark massive, destructive riots across the global south.
We do, however, have to look at the impartial steelman argument here. The reality is, many of the governments begging the IMF for help were running wildly irresponsible, heavily bloated budgets. They were funding ghost employees and massive militaries with endless printed money. In this light, the IMF argues that someone has to be the adult in the room and just say stop. They basically act as the necessary bad guy, absorbing the anger of the public so local politicians have the political cover they desperately need to enact incredibly painful but mathematically required structural reforms.
But how did this rigid playbook actually work out in reality? When the IMF spreadsheet math met brutal human realities on the ground, the results literally defined modern economic history. We're going to chronologically trace this impact through three of the most defining financial collisions of our time. Latin America's devastating lost decade in the 1980s, the rapidly spreading Asian financial contagion in 1997, and the massive precedent-setting Greek tragedy of 2010.
Let's look at the 80s first. The U.S. Federal Reserve spiked interest rates to nearly 20% to kill domestic inflation. That caused Latin American debt payments to explode overnight. The IMF stepped in with its Washington Consensus playbook, effectively acting as a strict debt collector for Western commercial banks. The result? A lost decade where Latin American per capita income dropped 11% and Brazilian inflation hit an unbelievable 2,000%. Fast forward to 1997, when the booming Asian tigers hit a liquidity crisis. The IMF prescribed the exact same harsh medicine, forcing sky-high interest rates that just crushed local businesses. It turned a regional stumble into a total depression, shrinking Indonesia's economy by nearly 14%. The harsh lesson learned, Asian nations immediately began hoarding massive reserves of US dollars, ensuring they would never, ever have to rely on the IMF again.
Then came 2010, and the biggest bailout in human history, the Greek tragedy. Greece was caught cooking its books, hiding a massive 12.7% government deficit. To prevent the entire Eurozone from collapsing, the IMF and European partners demanded crushing internal devaluation. Pensions were slashed by 40%. The minimum wage was cut by 22%. Unemployment spiked to 27%. But the immense controversy here, and the profound moral hazard, is that over 90% of this massive bailout money didn't actually go to the Greek public. It went straight back to the reckless French and German banks that had irresponsibly lent Greece the money in the first place. It heavily punished regular citizens for the sins of the elite.
For 70 years, the IMF enjoyed an absolute monopoly on economic salvation. But today, a major challenger has entered the arena, China's Belt and Road Initiative, establishing what some call the Beijing Consensus. Think about it like this. If the Washington Consensus acts like a strict parent, offering allowance money only if you clean your room, cut your budget, and reform your government, China acts like a rich uncle. They offer massive infrastructure loans, building massive projects like Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, but with zero conditionality. They don't demand budget cuts or democratic reforms. They just want to secure the assets and get paid back.
This new dynamic has led to what is essentially a zombie apocalypse in modern sovereign debt, which we're visibly seeing play out in nations like Zambia. See, when a country goes bankrupt, Western creditors in the Paris Club typically agree to take a haircut. Basically, they accept less than they are owed so the country can financially survive. China, however, operates totally outside these traditional rules and refuses to take that same haircut, demanding full repayment. This leaves the IMF stuck acting as a desperate mediator in a geopolitical Mexican standoff, while vulnerable economies remain entirely frozen, unable to import vital goods or create jobs while they wait.
And if China is the rival bank across the street, the second modern challenger is attempting to make the entire concept of central banking obsolete. In 2021, El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele made Bitcoin legal tender. Now, the IMF's entire model of fiat control requires a centralized system where governments can pull levers on floating exchange rates and use inflation as a tool. Adopting a highly volatile, decentralized asset with a hard-coded limit of 21 million removes that steering wheel entirely. From the IMF's perspective, this is absolutely terrifying because it completely strips away their traditional leverage.
So, the IMF swiftly retaliated against this gamble, effectively freezing El Salvador's access to loans and rightfully warning that risking a national treasury on a speculative, volatile asset is incredibly reckless when millions of lives are on the line. Yet, impartially looking at the ground truth, El Salvador didn't collapse. Their economy grew, and they successfully paid their massive 2023 and 2024 bonds entirely on time without an IMF bailout. And there is a glaring irony here. While the IMF warns of Bitcoin's volatility, IMF-backed fiat currencies like the Argentine peso have plunged 99% in value compared to Bitcoin's dramatic rise. El Salvador basically proved a nation could survive by simply saying no.
Speaking of the Argentine peso, that perfectly transitions us to the IMF's ultimate frequent flyer. The number 22 represents the exact number of financial agreements Argentina has signed with the IMF since 1958. In the grand narrative of global finance, Argentina acts as the chaotic protagonist, locked in an endless, deeply toxic subscription service with the lender of last resort. They are constantly making the exact same mistakes and expecting different results.
The absolute peak of this dysfunction arrived in 2018, when the IMF approved a staggering $57 billion loan to Argentina. It was the single largest loan in the institution's history, and it was a spectacular, almost immediate failure. The massive influx of dollars didn't fix the country. Instead, it largely subsidized capital flight for the wealthy, who quickly converted their pesos to dollars and wired them safely offshore to Miami and Switzerland. The average Argentine citizen was left drowning in hyperinflation, and the IMF was left holding a massive $44 billion bag for the funds they had already dispersed.
So the crucial point is that old quote from economist John Maynard Keynes. If you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. Well, Argentina owes the IMF $44 billion. Today, Argentina's new chainsaw-wielding libertarian president Javier Milei is aggressively slashing government spending. He's actually doing the IMF's austerity job for them, but far deeper and faster than they ever asked. He has essentially cornered the IMF, because if his extreme economic shock therapy fails and Argentina defaults, the IMF risks losing roughly 30% of its entire global lending portfolio. They are literally handcuffed together on a sinking ship.
So, synthesizing everything we've uncovered today, is the IMF the firefighter or the arsonist? Impartially speaking, it's both. As the firefighter, it acts as the messy but totally essential emergency room, stopping famines and keeping the hyper-connected Jenga tower of the global economy from catastrophic collapse. They really are the only true lender of last resort. Yet, as the arsonist, the institution is undeniably utilized as a political weapon that protects Western banks from their own bad investments, enforces systemic poverty through rigid austerity, and consistently forces the world's poorest citizens to pay the harsh bill for the sins of the elite.
Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, this doesn't directly affect me. But in our intensely hyper-connected world, when the IMF forces Egypt to devalue its currency, the global price of cotton shifts, and suddenly the t-shirt in your closet gets more expensive. The stability of your own savings is tied directly to the Jenga blocks managed in that glass building in DC. So knowing how the quotas work and understanding the brutal realities of conditionality, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to consider. If you were put in charge of the IMF for just one single day, looking at the full board of global finance, what is the very first thing you would change?